Some major changes are happening in Mexico that can have a big influence on the global economy. On the 2nd of June, the people of Mexico went to the ballot box, and the left-wing candidate, Claudia Sheinbaum, won the presidential election in a landslide with 59% of the votes. She represents a direct challenge to the political and economic elites who have dominated Mexico for many decades. Unlike most politicians, she actually comes from a working class background, and she's a scientist. She has a PhD in engineering, and she was previously the governor of Mexico City. The second place candidate represented the establishment political parties that had dominated Mexican politics for 100 years. Those parties combined, and yet their candidate could not even get 30% of the vote, just around 28%. And in addition to the presidency, the left-wing Morena party and its coalition allies from the Workers' Party and the Green Party in Mexico, their coalition won a majority in the Congress in both chambers. And Mexico has a federalized system like the US, and many states across Mexico now will have Morena representatives as the governor, including Mexico City. This shows that there is a transformative change happening in Mexico. The political establishment has been thoroughly defeated, and Mexico will be moving to the left at a time of geopolitical crisis. The US has been waging a new Cold War against China and Russia and trying to pressure its allies around the world to break ties. But Mexico has remained firmly independent, maintaining good relations with China and Russia and the US, refusing to take sides in this new Cold War. And Mexico's current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO, he is from the same left-wing Morena party of the new president-elect Claudia Sheinbaum. And what they represent is a new political class in Mexico that is not simply going to subordinate its interests to the United States. They want their country to be a power in the world, to be independent. They want their sovereignty to be respected. The current president, AMLO, nationalized the lithium reserves in Mexico, and he also fully nationalized the oil in the country that had been partially privatized by a previous US-backed right-wing president. Under AMLO, the Mexican government has been criticizing the US for meddling in its internal affairs, and Mexico has called for the US to stop carrying out aggressive policies against countries in the global south. Mexico has called for the end to the illegal US unilateral sanctions against Cuba, and Mexico has tried to unify Latin America as a bloc so the countries of the region can work together to lift themselves out of poverty and economically develop. And people in Mexico have seen very tangible results under President AMLO. The minimum wage has been raised by more than 80% in real terms, that is adjusted for inflation. Poverty has fallen. Incomes have significantly increased for most working people in Mexico. And this explains why President AMLO has an 80% approval rating, according to the US polling firm Gallup. That makes him one of the most popular leaders on earth. I recently made another video about that, which I will link to in the description below. Now, Mexico is a very important country geopolitically. In addition to being the neighbor of the United States, Mexico is the 10th most populous country on earth. Its population is bigger than that of Japan. And Mexico has the world's 12th largest economy. The Mexican economy is larger than that of Italy, South Korea, and Spain. And in Latin America, Mexico has the second biggest economy. Mexico also has a lot of very important natural resources, including oil and lithium, which have been nationalized by the government. They're state-owned. But it also produces gold, silver, copper, lead, zinc, and natural gas. And of course, Mexico is also a major producer of agricultural products. But in addition to raw materials, Mexico actually has a growing manufacturing sector, and its top exports are not raw materials, in fact. Among its top exports are cars, trucks, computers, and other electronics. And as the US is waging this new Cold War against China, it is pressuring companies to end their investments in China and instead friendshore or nearshore. And what we've seen is a massive increase of international investments in Mexico because the US, Mexico, and Canada have a free trade agreement. So now what we see is many US companies, but also many Chinese companies are investing in Mexico, including, for instance, Chinese electric vehicle companies like BYD, the world's leading EV manufacturer, and even Tesla is discussing making a big factory in Mexico as well. So Mexico's geopolitical position is very important and strategic in this moment. And now that the current government is left-wing, led by President AMLO, and the future president is going to be left-wing from the same political party, Claudia Sheinbaum, it is very likely that US government pressure on Mexico is going to continue to increase. We've already seen some examples of this. The US Chamber of Commerce, which is the lobby group that represents US corporations, warned that with the victory of Sheinbaum in the Mexican election, there are many risks. And as an example of some of those risks, the US corporate lobby group warned of the so-called protectionism going on under Mexico's left-wing government. That is, President López Obrador, AMLO, he nationalized the lithium and renationalized the oil. He also nationalized the electrical grid. And the US lobby group warns about AMLO's fourth transformation, which is the progressive movement that he declared that, as the Chamber of Commerce notes, wants to confront Mexico's elite and return equality, power, and resources to the country's masses. They portray that in negative terms, but this is true democracy. And they also are very much concerned that some US corporations will not be able to exploit the large natural resources in Mexico. Immediately after Sheinbaum won the election, the US corporate media also started warning that her government is bad for foreign investors and it won't put the interests of US corporations above the Mexican people. So there are many articles in the corporate media warning of her victory spooking markets and scaring off foreign investors. So joining me today to discuss what Sheinbaum's victory and Morena's landslide victory in Mexico will mean, not only for the country, but for Latin America and for the entire world, I spoke with the journalist José Luis Granados Ceja, who is the co-organizer of the group Mexico Solidarity Media, and he is the co-host of the podcast Soberanía, which is a show dedicated to helping to explain to an English language audience what is truly going on in Mexico, cutting through a lot of the propaganda in the corporate media. I will link to his show and social media account in the description below. Without further ado, here's our wide-ranging discussion. José Luis, thank you for joining me. It's a real pleasure having you. Let's talk about who the next president of Mexico is, Claudia Sheinbaum. I mentioned in the introduction that she's a scientist. She has a PhD in energy engineering. She was the governor of Mexico City, and she won in a massive landslide with 59% of the vote. That is more than double the second place candidate, Galvez, who only had 28%. So this is a massive Democratic mandate. Can you talk about why you think that she won in such a landslide and what people in Mexico are expecting from President Sheinbaum?
I mean, what an incredible victory. What an incredible moment to be part of, to be on the ground, to see history happen. And I think a lot of attention has been put on the fact that it's the first woman president. That shouldn't be discounted. It's quite extraordinary. The fact that she's somebody who comes from an ethnic religious minority in a heavily Catholic country. And I think that actually says something. And some of the discourse has been a little bit confused around this. I've seen a lot of chatter online about the fact that, she is of Jewish descent. She's culturally Jewish. She's not really a practicing in the religious sense. But the fact that it was a non-factor. Mexicans didn't care about that. They voted for her because she represented the continuity of the fourth transformation of Mexico. And I think that's the part that I would emphasize when we're thinking about Claudia Sheinbaum. And it's interesting also because it's an extraordinary profile. As you said in your introduction, climate scientist, member of a group of scientists who won a Nobel Prize, has a doctorate, educated in the US. But, if you actually go back a little bit into her history, she cut her teeth in the student movement, defending the right to education. There's even a picture of her protesting a Mexican government when she was studying in the US. This is a woman who has made her career of defending the interests of the working class, of the marginalized, just really quite an extraordinary profile. And I think that if she was running in some Western European country for some liberal party, she would be a darling. She'd be on all the headlines. Oh, the future is female, that kind of thing. But of course, no. She's running on behalf of a political project that is threatening the interests of US capital, that is defending national resources and national sovereignty. And so that's why you see this effort to kind of minimize who she is. I think the country is incredibly excited about what it represents. One thing to be part of that history, I did an interview with the coordinator of young women, Gracia Alzaga, and she said, this is something that we're doing for our great-grandmothers, our grandmothers, that we're being elected not just into the legislature, but to the highest office in power. That's really significant. I mean, my mother, when she was born, women didn't have the right to vote here in Mexico, and now we have a female president. But policy-wise, like I mentioned, she's going to continue the transformation. What does that mean? Well, we've seen it under López Obrador, historic investment in the most marginalized areas of the country, this effort to attend to the needs of the working class, of putting them front and center. I often say we should admit that this is a government that is polyclassist, right? There are different classes represented, but who's in the driver's seat? It's the working class. Their interests are first. That's why we've seen an increase in the minimum wage. That's why we've seen an increase in the standard of living. This is why we've seen a dramatic drop in poverty. 5 million people who used to be living in poverty no longer, and that's thanks to the investments. Some of the infrastructure, the mainstream media loves to talk about López Obrador's pet projects, right? They're not pet projects. Projects like the Trans-Isthmus Corridor, the Tren Maya, these are historical investments in the most forgotten parts of the country, to finally pay attention to them. And she's committed to carrying that out, to following through. And I'll end with this, because one of the things she always talked about on the campaign trail, which I think speaks to the way that she kind of envisions her government. López Obrador, when he came in, basically had to clean house. The country was in very dire straits. We were in the midst of a very serious political crisis. And he, in fact, you made a great point here, sharing the information from a Gallup poll. He's restored faith in Mexico's institutions. And she has talked about building the second floor of that. She gets to build on that foundation that López Obrador is leaving. I think she is very well positioned. We've rescued the state oil company. Now we'll have more resources to be able to invest in the population. I'm a family man, and I can't wait to see what Claudia Sheinbaum does for Mexico and for me and my working class family.
You mentioned the fourth transformation. This is something that was declared by the current left-wing president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known popularly simply as AMLO. And can you talk about what he means by the fourth transformation? It's this kind of almost revolutionary process. And also, can you talk about the political party that both López Obrador and Sheinbaum are part of, which is the Morena party, which stands as an acronym. It stands for the National Regeneration Movement. And kind of its origins going back to the Cardenistas, which, this goes back to the Mexican Revolution in the 1910s. And there was this very left-wing nationalist president, Lázaro Cárdenas, who famously in the 1930s, he nationalized the oil company. And then later, future governments also nationalized the energy grid. This is something that AMLO really emphasized when in his 6-year term. In Mexico, the presidential terms are 6 years. And in fact, in 2023, AMLO held this huge rally honoring the anniversary of the nationalization of oil. And he celebrated the fact that under AMLO, Mexico has nationalized its lithium. So can you talk about what the fourth transformation is, what Morena is, and what they represent in Mexican politics?
I think it would be correct to view Morena as the people who have inherited that legacy of being associated with that very long, very rich left-wing tradition in Mexico. And it's been a bit of a confused history, right? We had the Mexican Revolution, the first revolution in the Western Hemisphere of the 20th century, a huge social uprising that really was only eclipsed by the Russian Revolution. right? It was very significant. We've seen mass participation of an armed struggle against dictatorship, against the interests of transnational capital in the day. And that actually ties into this moniker of the fourth transformation. So what does he mean when he talks about that? The first transformation was the independence struggle, right? The effort to free Mexico of the yoke of Spanish colonial rule. The second transformation was the liberal period under Benito Juárez, who implemented these liberal reforms in that period in the 19th century. We know there was a lot of struggle between liberal and conservative forces. And then the third being the revolution. And this one now, I think you're right. I mean, it's on a par of revolutionary change. That's how significant it is. And in fact, when he threw that slogan out there, that moniker, they used to be like, how arrogant of Lopez Obrador, how dare he put himself on the same level? Well, we're almost at the end of his term now. And I think it's safe to say that this is the fourth transformation. It does rise to that level. It's not just, oh, another party was elected. It was a change of regime. It was a change of the actual order of things in this country, and consolidated now with this election result in 2024. And so, Morena was actually only founded 10 years ago in 2014. And it was born as a result of the fact that the left was basically orphaned. So we had the Mexican Revolution, and that process was probably its highest expression was Lázaro Cárdenas, as you mentioned. He was a general in the Mexican Revolution, and he very much wanted to actually fulfill the commitments that the whole process had actually made to the population of redistributing land, above all, of using the natural resources of the country, the incredible wealth that exists in Mexico, for the benefit of the population. But obviously that process kind of started to degrade in a sense. There was the foundation of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which is such a funny name, right? It's such a contradiction of terms, institutional revolution. And it became very much, as they said, a one-party dictatorship in Mexico. Even though it had nominal elections, they ran the show. They had very corporatist, clientelistic networks. And they were ousted in the year 2000 when Vicente Fox was elected on behalf of the right-wing National Action Party. And a lot of liberal commentators and pundits will talk about this as being Mexico's transition, right? As being when, it finally became a liberal democracy. The truth is, and I think it's important to understand why we saw the result that we did this Sunday here in Mexico, is that I call it the false democratic transition. It was very much, for our viewers here in the United States, kind of like the duopoly. You had two parties that were alternating in power, but the policies never substantially changed. The same figures were in power. The same kind of thinkers and the think tanks and all of the people who had any influence over the government rarely changed. And that does not represent a democratic transition. And I'll tell you why. It's because the population never really felt any kind of consequence to that so-called democracy. What did it matter to the person who didn't have enough money to pay for their medicines that now the PAN was in power? Nothing. That's not democracy. It's all form, right? There's no depth to it. And I think really the democratic transition happened under López Obrador, under Morena, right? I was talking about how it was only founded in 2014. It's extraordinary to see how such a young party can go from being founded to winning the presidency, to winning the majority of governorship races, to now consolidating with what is effectively can be called a re-election of the party's program under Claudia Sheinbaum. Of course, we should mention López Obrador didn't run for re-election because he's constitutionally prohibited from doing so. But it shows the population has faith in this. They understand that this is an authentic transition. This is a fourth transformation of Mexico. And Morena is full of left-wing voices and thinkers, right? If you're curious, because I find it so frustrating, so many people, I don't know why, but they insist on being the judges of what is or isn't leftist enough. And there's always these scare quotes around leftist President López Obrador. Take a look at the educational materials that the National Formation Institute of the party is offering, right? It's very much grounded in dialectical analysis, materialist analysis, the emphasis on class struggle, on the emphasis of needing to redistribute wealth, of confronting the interests of the oligarchy of capital. How is that not leftist? Just because he has, obeys some of the rules of macroeconomic stability? Yeah, of course. Mexico can't build a project that threatens U.S. capital in a sense that would put it in a weakened position and could effectively doom the actual program of the party. And I think they've actually done a really good job of balancing that. We also have a very well mobilized, well-organized party, a militancy. You know, this was a huge, huge election. Over 20,000 posts were being contested, from local representatives to the governorships, to the senators, to the federal Congress, the local Congress, obviously the presidency. And at these polling locations, I was accompanying many election observers. Morena was there, supervising the vote, participating. And that's thanks to an organized party apparatus that is interested in actually being consequential, to be a mass party.
Yeah, you mentioned some very important points there. One is the fact that, Mexico has this massive border it shares with the United States. It's a constant sword of Damocles hanging over its head. And now we see many Republicans in the US, including Trump and his allies, threatening to invade Mexico in the name of fighting cartels, if that's the excuse, right? But this is being very seriously considered, and it's a threat. And AMLO himself has condemned this and said famously, "We are not a US colony, we are not a US protectorate." And what's interesting is to see how he has defended his country's sovereignty directly to the face of top US officials. There was actually a funny virtual meeting that I saw between López Obrador and Kamala Harris, the US vice president. And she, of course, doesn't really know much about international politics. And in this meeting, this virtual meeting, López Obrador quoted this famous quote from Porfirio Díaz, who infamously said that in Mexico, we are cursed because we are so far from God, so close to the United States. AMLO said this in the meeting, and Kamala Harris apparently didn't really get it. But I do want to talk about that later on. The geopolitics, of course, something that I focus on a lot here, especially now with the new Cold War against China and Russia. But before that, I want to talk a little bit more about the internal situation in Mexico. Now, you talked about how Morena has become this serious national force. And this is important because the narrative for several years has been that basically AMLO, that he is a personalized, charismatic leader. And it's true, he is a very charismatic leader. He's very popular. This recent poll by Gallup shows that he has 80% support, making him one of the most popular leaders on earth. But basically, the argument was that Morena only exists in order to support AMLO, and it's not a real party. That was the narrative we heard for several years. The fact that Sheinbaum won with nearly 60% of the vote, this massive landslide, and Morena won many seats for the governors of many states across Mexico, including Mexico City, and Morena and its political allies from the Workers' Party and the Green Party have a majority in both chambers of Congress, shows that this is not just about López Obrador as the isolated figure, that it is a national movement, and it shows that they were able to break the back of the establishment political parties that have dominated Mexican politics for the entire modern history of Mexico for 100 years. You mentioned the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, which ironically, it actually does have in its very early origins, these kind of left-wing origins. In fact, Lázaro Cárdenas was the leader of the party, and the idea was they were going to institutionalize the gains of the revolution, right? But over the years, they moved to the right, especially in the neoliberal era, and there was a lot of corruption in the party. So what we saw is that in the past 3 elections, AMLO was one of the main candidates, and there's a lot of evidence suggesting that he actually won the 2012 election, but there was a lot of shady corruption going on. There was this Colombian hacker who later admitted to stealing votes and all this. But anyway, the point is that finally, in 2018, AMLO was this national figure, and he was very popular, and he was able to win the election. And of course, he helped to build Morena, but it is not just AMLO. So can you talk about the political structures in Mexico? It seems to me that basically Morena has been able to break those political structures. You mentioned the alternation between the PRI and PAN parties. And basically, it seems like those parties are dead. We saw that the PRI, the neoliberal party, which controlled Mexico for almost 100 years, the PAN, which is the right-wing, explicitly very conservative party, kind of closely allied with the Republicans in the US, and the supposedly center-left Social Democratic Party, the PRD, they actually formed an alliance to run candidates together, and they were completely crushed. And their candidate was Xochitl Gálvez, who was from the right of the coalition, and she couldn't even get 30% of the vote. And again, these are coming from a combined coalition of the parties that controlled Mexican politics for a century. I mean, this is truly incredible. Can you talk about that shift and what the future of Mexican politics could look like now?
Yeah, I'd love to begin by addressing a bit of the figure of López Obrador, because you're right. I think the people who are trying to cast the party as just a vehicle for his personal ambition are people who just don't have the right criteria to understand what's happening in Mexico. So certainly, he is a figure that in a lot of ways is larger than life. And I think it's correct to call him a political animal. And I think what we witnessed on Sunday, the transformation that he's led throughout his government, as you mentioned, the displacing of the old regime and the old political parties, it wouldn't have been possible without a figure like him. And I think he deserves the credit for leading this process in the way that he did. The landslide victory in 2018, that where he became president, it also meant a very strong majority in the Congress, so he was free to freely implement his program and actually engage in this transformation. That, I think, was a very, very important moment in Mexico's modern political history, and it wouldn't have been possible without López Obrador. But to think that it's just about him and his pieces on the chessboard and his party and all that is to misunderstand what it is. It is a vehicle for those democratic transformational aspirations of the Mexican population. You mentioned the PRD. The PRD was meant to be that, but we were orphaned. They became a thoroughly neoliberal party. They signed what in Mexico came to be known as the Pact for Mexico, together with Peña Nieto in 2012, and promoted a bunch of outright neoliberal economic and political reforms.
I'm sorry to cut you off, just for people who don't know. Enrique Peña Nieto was the president before López Obrador from 2012 to 2018 from the PRI party. He was a complete neoliberal who tried to privatize the state-owned oil industry. And AMLO, when he came in, he pledged to reverse all of those neoliberal policies implemented under
and in fact
Peña Nieto.
Yeah, and it successfully did, right? And so this idea that it's just his is untrue, and that somehow Claudia isn't going to be able to successfully lead it, I think they're mistaken. There was a very competitive process to select who the candidate was going to be in this election. There was a lot of, well-known figures, Marcelo Ebrard, who was the former foreign minister, Adán Augusto López, who was the former interior minister, Gerardo Noroña, who is a figure that many people in left-wing movements are familiar with. They all competed. Ultimately, Claudia came on top. And even there was a moment there where there was a risk that the party might split. Like, let's be honest about that. Marcelo Ebrard was unhappy that he did not get the nomination, but ultimately he rectified and said, no, I'm going to continue to be part of this movement because I understand that it's important to be united. That unity is still there. There's obviously difference of opinion and lots of different kinds of, there are no factions, but there are different kind of currents and ways of thinking. But suffice it to say, Claudia Sheinbaum is very much in charge. She is now the leader of the party. She is the leader of this government. She's the president-elect, and she's going to be the one to carry this transformation forward and to give it its own character. It's going to be a little bit different, right? So much of the mainstream media tried to emphasize that, she lives in his shadow. They tried to do the same thing with Dilma in Brazil, saying that, these women will never be which is a pretty sexist view, to be honest. Anybody who thinks that Claudia Sheinbaum is not going to be able to take command of the country and of this political transformation is somebody who's unfamiliar with her work. She is a determined, hardworking, leftist woman who is very well positioned to be able to carry this forward. And I think that's a lot of what we should be expecting in terms of this new government. And I think one of the key things that I would emphasize is that, there has been this unfortunate situation, which is so common in any kind of left-wing administration, where when your political adversaries lose power, political power, they turn and they hide in their conservative strongholds. And here in Mexico, I would say there's basically three. So there's the private media. The attacks against López Obrador are constant, although he's been very smart to do these morning press conferences to kind of change the narrative every day. There is the support from US imperialism. And then there's also the judicial branch of government, which is thoroughly corrupt and thoroughly in bed with the old regime. And so they're going to try to conspire against the Claudia Sheinbaum government from these conservative strongholds. I think the duty of the left-wing forces is to displace them even from these places where they've taken refuge. And so the proposal that was made at one point was what became to be known as the Plan C here in Mexico, which is let's win a supermajority in the next election so we don't need to go negotiate with anybody, and we can do constitutional reforms, and we can fix the judicial branch of government, and we can make these more serious transformations in terms of, in the legislature. And it was a lofty goal. I think in a lot of ways, people thought it was a possibility, but a remote possibility. But if we look at the results, certainly in the lower house of Congress, Morena and its allies secured that two-thirds supermajority. They don't need to negotiate with the opposition. The possibilities are endless. And I do think it opens up the potential for a much deeper transformation, something that goes much more seriously against this. In fact, if you look at the way that they're responding now, suddenly the people who dominated us, who ridiculed the population, who said that we didn't deserve to rule, well, now they're talking about how they're the poor, persecuted minority, and their rights must be respected. Oh, please listen to us, because you can't forget that there are other opinions in this country. Well, you know what? When you receive 60% of the vote, that's an incredible mandate. Throughout the world, especially in places like Western Europe, Canada, you can receive less than a majority and have majority control of your legislature, the executive, or whatever you want, right? And they'll pretend that that's legitimate. Well, here in Mexico, there's nothing more legitimate than that mandate. They have every right, and I hope they follow through on it, to actually do those deeper transformations, to finally go after that rotten judicial branch of government, to push them out of those conservative strongholds, to weaken them. I do a lot of work with Venezuela, and Hugo Chavez has this incredible speech where he really well synthesizes Gramsci's conception of hegemony. Well, Morena and the forces that support it are establishing their new hegemony. And that's quite significant in terms of actually understanding that, it's not an exaggeration to say that this is truly a watershed moment. How will they be able to respond? We quite possibly could be before a moment where these old pro-oligarchy forces will not be able to recover. And that means that the interests of the working class will always be front and center. And you know what that means? That means we can actually start talking about things like the communalization of life, of actually breaking with these kind of straitjackets that capitalism imposes on us. Obviously, and I think we'll probably get into this a little bit later, there is still, and I think one of the major challenges is US imperialism. I think the more that they feel isolated, as we've seen in Bolivia, as we've seen in Nicaragua, as we've seen in Venezuela, right, as we've seen in Cuba, the opposition and their forces will run into the arms of imperialism, because that's the only place where they feel like they have any hope of recovering the power that they lost.
So, José Luis, in the introduction, I mentioned this statement that was published by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. This is the main lobby group representing U.S. companies, and they warn of risks for the new President Sheinbaum. And at the bottom of this, they note that there has been a wave of so-called protectionism in Mexico, which is really defending its economic sovereignty. They mention the fourth transformation of AMLO in pretty negative terms. And then they, in particular, mention the fact that under AMLO, Mexico has been exercising more control over its strategic natural resources, especially oil, but also other strategic minerals. And I mentioned that under AMLO, Mexico nationalized also its large lithium reserves. And in addition to oil and lithium, Mexico is a producer of gold, silver, copper, lead, zinc, natural gas, agricultural products. This is a country that's very rich in natural resources. And now that Sheinbaum is coming in, I mentioned that she has a PhD in energy engineering. She is a climate scientist. And the fact that she was involved in receiving a Nobel Prize is incredible, considering how scientifically illiterate many US politicians are, who refuse to acknowledge that climate change is even real. And anyway, the point is that this is a moment that's very important for Mexico economically, not only with the geopolitical conflicts, which I want to ask you about in the next question, but also with climate change, with the move toward renewable energy technology, green technology. Mexico has a lot of potential. There is a lot of investment going on right now in Mexico. And with this US idea of so-called friendshoring, it's pressuring companies to withdraw from China and instead friendshore and invest in Mexico. And China, for its part, many Chinese companies are also investing in Mexico. In particular, in green technology areas, electric vehicles. In fact, Mexico right now has a lot of interest from Chinese electric vehicle makers like BYD, the world's leading EV maker, and Tesla. Elon Musk wants to create a big factory in Mexico. So there's a lot of interest. And of course, given the fact that Sheinbaum has this background, I think she's going to take advantage of that and encourage the production of renewable energy technology. So what is your view of the situation of the economy in Mexico, the foreign investment, the potential for more good industrial jobs, manufacturing jobs, and what role Mexico can play in the transition away from fossil fuels while still maintaining national control over its natural resources and using them while we're transitioning, still using those resources to fund social programs and economic development?
Yeah, if you go to my Twitter account, you'll see my banner image. And it's actually from that demonstration that you talked about previously of López Obrador defending national sovereignty, which happened in the context of celebrating here in Mexico. We literally have a holiday to celebrate the expropriation of the oil industry. And so on this occasion, March 18th, they hold this huge demonstration, fill up the Zócalo. And on one of the buildings that faces this big, huge plaza in the heart of Mexico City was this image, where on the left was Lázaro Cárdenas, and it said the expropriation of the oil industry. And then on the right, there was López Mateos, who expropriated the electricity industry. And in the middle was López Obrador, who expropriated, nationalized lithium in this country. It gives you an idea of, we talked about this previously, of this kind of continuity. This is part of a program that is recovering the best of Mexican political history. But it also speaks to the economic agenda of this country and under López Obrador and under Claudia Sheinbaum, which is going to be, no one says investment isn't welcome here. Like you said, Elon Musk, the right-wing reactionary in many ways, came to Mexico to talk about opening a plant, although it actually hasn't progressed. There was a lot of noise, but then ultimately nothing has happened as of yet. Mexico, under López Obrador, became the #1 trading partner of the United States. It's not China, it's not Canada, it's Mexico. And so there's still clearly, an interest and willingness to engage with private capital, to engage with investment, to obviously participate in international trade. We live in a world that is very much interconnected, particularly Mexico, because of the North American Free Trade Agreement, now called something else. There is integrated supply lines. No one says that is, an issue. The point that we're trying to make here in Mexico under this government is that there need to be good wages. People need to have social security. You need to have access to a democratic trade union, all of these kinds of things that we didn't have before. I always kind of talk about, how was the PRI able to maintain this dictatorship? Well, the bargain was this. Okay, you're not going to have democratic unions. You're not really going to have much of an actual democracy, but you're going to have a good standard of life. That was the bargain. Well, that bargain ended up evaporating under neoliberalism, where now you had the worst of both worlds. You have to engage with the interests of the ruling class, the transnational capital, and you're not going to get really much in exchange. You're going to have a pittance of a wage. You're going to be, what's that called? Outsourced your job, all this kinds of things, these contracts that don't provide any kind of stability or security. And one of the priorities of López Obrador and now Claudia Sheinbaum is to change that, to make it so that, for example, you mentioned nearshoring or friendshoring. Sure, you want to build things so that you have, your supply chain a little bit closer. You want to break away from reliance on manufacturing in China for whatever reason. Then sure, build here, but it's going to be under different circumstances. You're not going to be able to just walk all over the working class the way that it was before. On the issue of climate change, it's interesting because, gosh, the mainstream media coverage of Mexico and Sheinbaum in particular has just been atrocious, right? They almost always led with things like, she's his handpicked successor, ignoring that there was actually a process to decide who was going to be the candidate. And as I mentioned, was actually a contentious bit of a competition that threatened to weaken the unity of the party. Or they'll say that she'll never live out of his shadow, or that the fact that, like, well, she may have been a climate scientist, but she backed his interest in these dirty oil producing projects, et cetera, et cetera. So here's the thing. When we talk about the climate, when we talk about carbon economy, the emissions and all of that, I think it's always important to have an anti-imperialist perspective. Who have been the countries that have historically contributed the most to greenhouse gas emissions, to climate change, the reason we're in this situation. Right? For example, Mexico City now is in the midst of its third heat wave. We are paying the price of this. But who caused it? It's Western Europe. It's North America. It's the US and Canada. It's Australia. It's Japan. They're the ones who are responsible for this, and they're the ones who have to take action. I'm not going to be lectured by somebody like Joe Biden, who opened up drilling in Alaska, about the refinery that López Obrador built in order to guarantee energy security in Mexico. Do we need to do more? Of course. Everybody needs to do more. But this idea that the responsibility falls upon the global South because it wants to use its resources to go and plow it back into the nation, into the hands of the people, I think is supremely unfair to try to pin it on the global South. And that's what they do. It's an extension of imperialism. And one of the criticisms they often made was that, oh, López Obrador decided to re-emphasize, the state-owned, like we saw in that Chamber of Commerce image there, industries and the state-owned energy producers. Well, that's because these reforms that were passed under the neoliberal president, Peña Nieto, they were sweetheart deals to private companies, right, from Spain, who wanted to, under the guise of producing green energy, basically leach resources out of the population, out of the state. There were actually, the contract said that the state transmission company was obligated to buy energy from them first, even if it was more expensive, even if it was less reliable, to the detriment to the interests of the population, who had to pay more and had less reliable service. How is that better? It was just a way of masking what is the same thing, this interest of transnational capital to penetrate the global South, to get its teeth into our resources and get rich, and then expropriate the assets and take them back to their home countries, to their investors and things like that. So people who talk about that are absurd. There was actually one good article that came out that talked about the fact that, if you're talking about wanting to get companies to change, to start to rely more on green energy and things like that, what makes more sense? Floating incentives out there so that private companies might take them up and might actually do it, or have a state-owned, state-controlled organization or company that you can just mandate, hey, you have to do things this way. And I do think that one of the things where we'll probably see a bit of a shift from López Obrador, he's a man of the 70s, right? The oil boom of Mexico. Is that Claudia Sheinbaum is likely to invest more in green energy initiatives, right? She led some pretty interesting ones here in Mexico City. Mexico City is a behemoth of a city. It's incredible that it works at all. And the way that the city is fed is this place called the Central del Bastos, which is just this massive complex where food is distributed to the entire region. She built solar panels on top of that to generate energy. It's the largest project of its kind in a major urban center. It gives you an idea of the way that you can do things that are state-led and that actually produce results. You want to mitigate the effects of climate change? Do that. I'll give you another example. Boy, does the wealthy class in this country love to lament the fact that López Obrador canceled this massive airport that they wanted to build on what used to be a lake. I can't imagine what this heat wave would feel like if they had been successful in paving over that lake, right? That absorbs so much of the heat. It'd be unbearable. Instead of being at 35 degrees, we'd be at 40 degrees. I'm so glad he didn't pursue that project and build a different airport, right? These are the kinds of arguments that I think they fall flat on their face because they're just ways of masking the interests of transnational capital. And I think if we're looking at actually improving people's lives, it's much, much more sane to put an emphasis on state-led initiatives the way that López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum is set to do.
Yeah, another example is that AMLO nationalized the energy grid, which had been partially privatized as well. And in fact, the US government was trying to take legal action to punish Mexico because US companies could no longer invest in the privatization of Mexico's energy grid. So we see many examples of this. It's deeply hypocritical. Now the US is spending literally trillions of dollars on its own industrial policy through the Inflation Reduction Act, the Chips and Science Act, in order to try to bring industrial jobs back to the US. But when Mexico tries to protect its economic sovereignty, then, oh, well, that's bad, that's evil, it's socialism. Well, I want to also talk about the geopolitics, because, of course, this is very important. We see that the US has been many US politicians have been invoking the Monroe Doctrine, this 200-year-old colonial doctrine, telling sovereign countries in Latin America that they cannot have good relations with China and Russia. And Mexico, being, the US neighbor, largest trading partner of the US, has really been hit hard by this. But in his defense, AMLO has stood up for Mexico's national interests. In 2023, he met with President Xi, and China and Mexico signed an agreement pledging to deepen their relations. And there was another very interesting moment that I wrote an article about back in 2022, in which the US government was using media outlets to accuse Mexico of hosting more Russian spies than any other country, of course, with no evidence, but they were attacking Mexico. This is part of this years-long US government campaign to demonize AMLO's government. And in response, in one of his morning press briefings, the Mañaneras, AMLO criticized the US, and he said, Mexico is not a colony, criticizing this idea that Russians are not allowed to live in Mexico, and also disputing the fact that they were supposedly spies. And what we've seen is that the US has really been trying to pressure Mexico to cut off relations with China and Russia, but Mexico has been saying, no, we're non-aligned. We're officially non-aligned. And in fact, Mexico had been a part of the original non-aligned movement. And what we've also seen, what's incredible, is that under AMLO and Morena, we've seen that Mexico is returning to this policy that goes back to the 1930s, which is known as the Estrada Doctrine, which used to be Mexico's foreign policy. It was non-aligned for 100 years, basically, saying we are not going to ally with one of these major powers. We're going to pursue our own independent national interests. And now we see Mexico today returning to that policy after, in the neoliberal era, especially in the 90s and 2000s, it really just became a kind of proxy of the US. So can you talk about how you've seen Mexico's foreign policy shift? And then after, I want to ask you about, in terms of Latin American integration. Let's talk more generally now about global politics.
Yeah, I mean, no to the new Cold War with China, right? And Mexico is on the right side of history when it comes to that. There are very powerful forces that are very much interested in ratcheting up that tension to the detriment of possibly the future of humanity. Do we really want to play that game? I mean, who's going to win? It's going to be the people at the top, and meanwhile the rest of us are going to have to suffer. So I'm very proud of the fact that we returned to that kind of policy and are pursuing healthy relationships. And I'll give you like an anecdote to talk about what that means up here as somebody living in Mexico City. Mexico City under Claudia Sheinbaum, where she was previously the governor, renewed its fleet of vehicles for public transportation, and almost all of them are Chinese made. They're Yutong or the BYD. Right. And the line that is closest to me is entirely 100% electric buses. And that's the kind of, we were talking about climate change. Those are the kinds of things that matter. And we were able to afford these vehicles because guess what? China makes cheaper vehicles. And I'm glad that they make them, because that means that we're actually able to afford them and renew them, and now service is more reliable. These are the kinds of things like, it's funny, these pundits, they move around in Uber or they move around in their private vehicles. Some of them even have chauffeurs, right? Well, the rest of us, the majority of us, this is how we have to live and work. And, it's a lot better to be able to have that reliable transit, that safe, clean, new vehicle. In fact, sometimes I'll always be like, let's take this route because it's actually more comfortable. These are the kinds of things that very kind of tangible ways that relationship is translating into. And at the same time, he's also, kind of letting who's ever interested in participate, and not really favor them either, right? There was a bit of a negotiation there to try to see if they could give preferential deals, and ultimately that didn't come through. But that didn't stop Chinese investment here in Mexico. There's been an explosion of it, and it's welcomed for the same reason, right? Come, if you're interested in investing, if you want to have access to the U.S. market by investing in Mexico. It's funny how sometimes they'll even vilify that. Oh, they're trying to sneak in through the back door. Absurd, right? These are the same free market ideologues who are now imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese products. But if you want to come, fine, right? But make sure that you are abiding by our laws and all of this. But on the bigger picture, right? So we were talking about the geopolitical situation. Mexico occupying this space, it's an important diplomatic country. It punches above its weight. It is the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. It is the second largest economy in Latin America. It's important that Mexico have this kind of leadership on the global stage to resist things. I know we're going to get into Latin America in a second here, but I do want to mention things like, for example, recognizing and respecting the sovereignty of other countries, of not falling into this trap of playing these regime change kind of games that the US pushes into. We always compare things to the previous regime. Enrique Peña Nieto was a leading figure in the so-called Lima group that sought to oust Nicolás Maduro from power. That ended with López Obrador. And in fact, that's been positive news for the Venezuelan people. I'll give you another example. In the case of Cuba, right? There is pressure from the Treasury Department in the US because Pemex is selling oil to Cuba. And López Obrador in his mañanera had an excellent response. I loved it because he's like, let me just say this once and for all, so it's clear to everybody. We will sell to Cuba because they're a good people, and if we want to sell to them, we will. That kind of dignity is really important, and that's projected globally, right? You haven't seen Mexico fall into this game of trying to join the effort to attack Russia in the context of the Ukraine conflict, right? What has been Mexico's position? Peaceful resolution to this conflict. We have obviously the issue of our day, which is the conflict in the genocidal campaign Israel is waging in Palestine. What has been Mexico's position? And I think in some ways it's a little bit tepid in the sense that it could be stronger and calling out the genocide on a more consistent basis. But Mexico is one of the few countries that has signed on to the ICJ case that's happening together with Nicaragua, right? And Chile, I believe, just recently joined as well. So it's only a handful of countries saying, no, we need to trust in these institutions. You created these institutions. These are yours. These are part of your, international world order. Well, let's actually be consequential about it. That's important. And a country like Mexico taking that position is important. Mexico, under López Obrador, recognized the state of Palestine. It's one of the few countries in Latin America that hadn't done it yet. I'm glad that is happening. The world is changing. If you want to stay with the old order that is collapsing, that is lashing out, I think honestly, you're setting yourself up for failure. Embrace a multipolar world. Embrace a world where there is a positive relationship, yes, with Biden, but also with Putin and Xi Jinping. There's nothing wrong with that, particularly in the global South. I love this quote. I forget who says it, so my apologies to it. But they say that when the United States visits the global South, we get a lecture. When China visits the global South, we get hospitals and bridges and roads. So who are we going to work with? Well, the people who want to work with us. And I think that makes perfect logical sense. The only people who object to that are people who are actually hiding the true interest behind that, which is defending that old US-led imperialist order.
Yeah, and Mexico represents the view that most countries in the global South have, which is that they don't want war. They certainly don't want a new Cold War. They want to develop, and they are willing to work with any country that respects their sovereignty. And increasingly, it's the US that does not respect their sovereignty, and China and Russia that do. And in the so-called democracy summit that Joe Biden organized, in fact, AMLO gave this very, kind of indirect criticism of the US where he condemned oligarchy, and he said, we shouldn't have countries that claim to be democracies that are actually oligarchies, referencing comments that he had previously made when the US State Department published these reports condemning Mexico and meddling in its internal politics and in judicial reform. And in return, AMLO, in one of his morning press briefings, said that the US is an oligarchy, and he said Mexico is more democratic than the US. And we can see in these elections that it genuinely is more democratic, although, of course, the US is so undemocratic, it's a very low-hanging fruit. But on the subject of Latin America, this is, of course, so important. And when we're talking about Mexico's foreign policy, AMLO himself had always been much more focused on domestic politics. But one of the things that he really did emphasize is increasing integration with Latin America, which is important because in the past few decades with the neoliberal and right-wing leaders in Mexico, most of them simply looked to the north, to the US in terms of their foreign policy, and basically did whatever Washington wanted. But what we've now seen is we talked about, good relations with China and Russia, but also AMLO played an important role in calling for the end to the illegal 6-decade-long US blockade against Cuba. He called for an end to the US sanctions on Venezuela. And he was a big supporter of regional integration through organizations like the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. And in 2021, Mexico City held the CELAC summit. And famously, in one of his press briefings, AMLO also joked about how the Organization of American States was completely irrelevant. This is the US-dominated OAS based in Washington, which has been used to try to overthrow governments like in Venezuela or Bolivia, backing coups, or to meddle in their internal affairs. And AMLO quoted this song by a revolutionary Cuban singer who, there's this famous song by Carlos Puebla who said, you know, the OAS is so ugly, it makes you laugh, ha, ha, ha. So, I mean, the fact that the southern neighbor of the US was criticizing the US oligarchy, condemning US meddling in the region and blockades and sanctions, and calling for Latin America to unite. I mean, this is absolutely historic. How do you think that will continue going forward under President Sheinbaum? And within Morena and within the social movements in Mexico, what do people think about the role of Mexico in integrating with Latin America and not only looking north, but also looking south?
You know, it's a point of pride for people who are supporters of Morena. This means a lot to occupy that place, to responsibly use that position. You know, like I mentioned, being the largest Spanish-speaking country, to be one of the major economies in the region, but also kind of being that buffer. You know, we are the ones that have to have the United States on our border, and there is a risk to taking these kinds of positions. But it's been interesting to see how it's no skin off Lopez Obrador's back to take these positions. And despite the tremendous pressure that they do apply against the government to try to get them to align with the interests of US imperialism. And, you know, as you said, there's these great examples of him, you know, quoting Simon Bolivar and talking about Latin American integration, about mocking the OAS, et cetera, et cetera. This is, you know, it's not just symbolic because it's been consequential as well, but it is a point of pride. You know, during this election, I accompanied international observers like Jorge Arriaza from Venezuela, right? There was Clara Lopez Obregón from Colombia. There was a number of other people who come from different parts of Latin America who similarly feel the same way. We have a brotherhood, a sisterhood, a camaraderie that we should be there for each other and supporting each other and defending the sovereignty of each other and respecting the democratic mandates that are emanating from our peoples, of having that kind of two-way relationship with Latin America, of resisting this urge to align ourselves with this powerful bloc that is US-led. And I think with Claudia Sheinbaum, it's going to continue. I mean, it is one of the pillars of this project. We talk about soberanía, right? There's a reason we named the podcast that. It's one of the pillars of the fourth transformation of Mexico. But it's not just soberanía for me and none for you, right? It's sovereignty for all and respecting the sovereignty of all. And it makes for a much more positive relationship. Yeah, I would love to highlight for a minute here the role in rescuing CELAC. So CELAC was born out of an initiative led by Hugo Chavez, right? And it came in that context of that first pink wave of Latin America. We saw leftist and progressive governments elected. You know, it's not an accident that when there was that conservative restoration, when the pendulum swung the other way, that one of the first things they tried to do was destroy CELAC, destroy UNASUR, because they understood that regional unity does represent a threat to US hegemony. And I'm so glad that Mexico took on the challenge of rescuing it and putting it back, of lifting it up. There are other initiatives. Grupo de Puebla is very active here in Mexico. They were active sending a delegation. Alberto Fernandez was in town as well here, participating as an election observer. So it's important that we have these spaces. And Mexico is uniquely positioned of being able to do it. I think it's easier to demonize countries that are far away and maybe lack the resources to be able to really kind of invest to make sure that these initiatives are able to succeed, and it's paying off, right? You know, we went from a period where there was this absurd notion that all of these countries throughout the globe recognized this guy who raised his hand in the Municipal Plaza in Caracas as president of Venezuela. You know, I think Mexico's role in defense of Venezuela's democracy and sovereignty was really key. I always tell this anecdote. So if we remember that day when Juan Guaido declared himself president of Venezuela. It was a scary moment for those of us who have always accompanied Venezuela. I remember thinking, I was like, how are they going to get out of this one? This is serious. This was clearly planned ahead. This is playing to a certain script. And I was watching it live, the way that country after country that at the time was ruled by right-wing presidents in the region were recognizing him as president. The momentum is against us. Where is this going to go? And then around 11 o'clock in the morning, Mexico issues a statement saying, no, we don't recognize this guy, right? We have a relationship with the government of Nicolás Maduro. And that stopped that momentum. Suddenly, it wasn't that convincing of a case to be like, oh, well, no, there's regional consensus. All of his neighbors no longer recognize him. Actually, one of the major economies in the region says no. And that really disrupted the narrative. And thanks to that, the coup wasn't successful, and now Venezuela's been in a much better position. Mexico received a lot of criticism for inviting Maduro to that select summit. But I will tell you that from here, the view from the bottom, so forget the pundits, forget all of these voices that you usually hear, that meant a lot to us to have that kind of positive relationship with our friends and neighbors. And it's very important. I don't imagine a scenario where Claudia Sheinbaum breaks with that. Again, we have to emphasize this. She comes from the left. She has been schooled in these same kinds of ideas and traditions. And if anything, she's better positioned to be able to say it because she has a strengthened economy, she has a strengthened mandate, who can really tell her to change her position. And if they think that she's going to be more susceptible to pressure, I think they're sorely mistaken.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. Mexico is in a really good position. Geopolitically, economically, it's going to be able to take advantage of, this constant U.S. aggression against China by, maintaining this non-aligned policy in support of the non-aligned movement. It'll be able to, have good relations with both sides and try to prevent this new Cold War from escalating. And also for the people of Mexico, I mean, very briefly, maybe you can mention, just the significant increase in quality of life. We've seen big reductions in poverty. We've seen a huge raise in the minimum wage, much more than any other country in the Western Hemisphere. We've seen, although, of course, there is a lot of instability and insecurity and violence in Mexico, it's getting a little better over time. Maybe just in the last 2 or 3 minutes here, maybe as we wrap up, you can talk about how life has been getting better. And a lot of people in Mexico are rightfully optimistic. Well, a lot of people in the US are pessimistic.
Yeah, I've mostly been emphasizing the positives. There are a lot of issues that are still yet to be challenged, security being the number one. Although I will say that Claudia Sheinbaum, when she presided over a dramatic decrease of violence and crime here in Mexico City, it'll be a challenge to apply some of these similar policies at a national level. But I have to be optimistic that things will improve. Things have at least leveled off. We had seen just a huge increase of violence and deaths, of homicides, of the organized crime groups growing in terms of influence and power. That has leveled off. The situation is actually, if moderately, but actually improving. We have to continue on that trend. A lot of that responds to other things that are out of our control, right? I think oftentimes people overemphasize the supply side of the problem, and really the demand is the issue. As long as there's still a market that is interested in these illicit substances, the misuse of drugs, there will be people looking for ways to actually be able to service that market. So there's still things to work on. There still needs some advancement when it comes to emphasizing respect for indigenous territories, although that's one of the constitutional reforms that's on the agenda right now, about recognizing indigenous peoples as subject of rights, to ingrain that in the Constitution. But to go back to the positives, absolutely. I was actually just looking at some very raw numbers in terms of just how dramatically people's incomes improved under López Obrador, right? People who are detached from that reality have struggled to understand why the election went the way that it did, why it was a landslide. I think part of it is because they didn't leave their bubbles and they were convinced. It was hilarious. There was this one pundit on this program saying that, but when I was on the plane from Paris, everybody was against López Obrador. Well, this is who's flying from Paris to Mexico. But anyway, the people at the bottom, our lives got way, way better. I always talk about the fact, to give a personal narrative. So I did a master's degree at the Autonomous University of Mexico City, which is a university that was funded by López Obrador. And not only did I not have to pay tuition, I was paid actually a wage, the average worker's wage of approximately 14,000 pesos a month, so that I could focus on my studies full time. I tell US students that, and you can see the way that their eyes bulge, that it's just incredible, whereas they're being indebted, right? I had a new cable car line that was built outside of my home at the time, where I literally crossed the street, got on the cable car, had this nice smooth ride, got down to the subway, which cost 30 cents to go to school every day. So my commute was calm, was happy to go and be able to focus on my studies full time. I was able to, have a comfortable life. On the weekends, I would go to one of the massive new public parks that Claudia Sheinbaum built, where maybe the Secretary of Culture was putting on a free concert. You know what I mean? Like I could have a nice little picnic without having to spend money. One of the things that was tough, I lived many, many years in North America, and Canada, and the United States. You couldn't leave the house without spending tons of cash. And so I ended up staying home most of the time. And that's not a good way to live. So when people felt this change, when we talk about the seniors who receive this universal pension, right? They went from having to bag groceries for pocket change to be able to go out and have a meal at a restaurant with their grandkids, once a month. I know that doesn't sound like a lot to some people, but that's dignity. And how are you going to convince people that they should go back to the old ways? Of course, you were never going to be able to convince them. That's what it boils down to. And it's not like, oh, these poors, all they're getting is handouts from the government, which is a bit of the way that the discourse played out in this election. No, these are rights. Claudia Sheinbaum always talks about these are your rights. You have a right to housing. You have a right to access to culture. You have a right to education, to health. We still have a long ways to go, but at least there's an understanding that that's the end goal. Finally, on one personal anecdote, my partner ended up having the need to a pretty major surgery. For people in the United States, they know the immense pressure of fear of having a major health issue, of how it can basically bankrupt you and end any possibility of you being able to uplift you or your children because of medical debt. So she similarly is a student that had coverage from the public system. And the public system for many years was deeply, deeply underinvested. But when we needed it, it was there. We had highly qualified doctors, constant care. When we went into the surgery, she was expected to be hospitalized for 2 nights because of some excessive bleeding. She ended up being hospitalized for 5 nights. But there was no pressure to like, oh no, we got to free up the bed, get out of here. There was no, hey, go to the pharmacy down the street and bring some gauze because we don't have any more here. Even the food was free and healthy and delicious. And that's what it means to have strong institutions that are funded by the state, that are there when you need it. And we didn't have to spend a penny. And now we don't have that pressure of trying to figure out how to pay off that debt. And my partner is alive today because we had that public system to rely on. These are the things that matter. These are the things that people think about when they're in that ballot, in that voting booth, deciding who to vote for. I know that's what I was thinking about when I was crossing that X on my ballot, and I can show them my thumb to show that we voted. We use the indelible ink here, and so I don't want to give a reductive, simple analysis that it's just that. I think we've talked a lot about other things around dignity, around respect for the policy that's been implemented, of occupying a different place in the world, of being proud to say that I come from Mexico and I'm proud of what the government has been doing and the place it's occupying on the global stage. Of López Obrador, for example, talking about, hey, you want to talk about the immigration crisis, which is a major issue. Mexico absorbs many of the migrants that are transiting through on their way to the United States, where López Obrador says, you know what, you want to stop migration? End the blockade of Cuba. Lift the sanctions against Venezuela. That's never talked about in US media, and it should be. But here, we're aware of it. And we understand that that's the actual correct path. And I'm glad that the Mexican voters this last Sunday affirmed that correct path. I think, again, I began this interview talking about, I can't wait to see what Mexico and Mexico City will look like under the Morena-led administration. I'm very excited to see, and I'm very hopeful for the future of my family.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. And I'll say it's not just you, of course, it's tens of millions of Mexicans, the majority of the population, as we can see in the results of this amazing election, this landslide victory for Morena. I was joined by José Luis Granados Ceja. And José Luis, as we wrap up, can you tell people where they can find your work?
Yeah, so I'm an organizer with the Mexico Solidarity Project, and one of the major initiatives is Mexico Solidarity Media. We talked a lot about how coverage of Mexico is flat out wrong or biased. So what we try to do is actually amplify voices of Mexicans, of other Latin Americans who are talking about what's happening here in the country, having our voices well represented, sometimes with the simple act of translating something that maybe isn't available. We also provide original news articles and analysis. And of course, the Soberanía podcast, which I co-host with Kurt Hackbarth, who's a writer for Jacobin and Sentido Común, where again, we break down the news and give an analysis with that working class perspective to challenge the mainstream media narrative. You know, even places that you wouldn't expect so much bias from, like ProPublica, right? The Texas Observer, AP, they've all been part of this campaign to vilify Mexico under López Obrador and are likely going to continue with Claudia Sheinbaum. So look for these alternative sources, break that media blockade. And I want to say thanks to you, Ben, and your work. I think it's really important that we're able to have these conversations. And I'm really glad that people are also engaged with your program and all the work that you're doing and seeing that. You've done also excellent coverage of Mexico in particular and Latin America. So anyway, you can find us Mexico Solidarity Media. If you put that up in Google, Soberanía Podcast, you can find me on social media as well at Granados Ceja.
And I will put those links in the description below so everyone can check out your work. Mutual admiration. I really appreciate the work that you do, José Luis, and we'll be in touch in the future. Thanks a lot for joining me today.
Abrazos.